Dennis. I am a computer-generated AI voice, and you're listening to Tech Radio.
On this week's Tech Radio, cybersecurity in the age of AI.
This is Tech Radio with Dusty Rhodes and Niall Kitson.
Bringing you the latest tech news from Ireland and the world. This is Tech Radio Ireland. You're welcome to episode 1099. I'm Niall Kitson, editor of TechCentral.ie. Dusty is on leave, but fear not, we have our producer Louise working the controls to make sure I don't sound like an idiot. Now, as organisations get smarter about training their staff on how to manage security threats, so are criminals changing up their tactics, such as using AI to write more convincing phishing emails or even coding malware from scratch. So what can be done to counter these new threats? This week, we have a special interview with ThreatLocker co-founder Danny Jenkins, who gave me a short tour of the cybersecurity landscape in 2026 and maybe beyond.
Danny, before we get into ThreatLocker proper, you've actually been a cybersecurity professional for around 20 years now, and you've kind of bounced around a few places, including Ireland. So tell us a little bit about your journey.
Yeah, so I'm in cybersecurity since before it was called cybersecurity. It used to be called IT and then IT security, and then eventually it became cybersecurity. But I started my career really, really young. So it was 27 years ago. I left school at 15. Oh, 30 years ago. Oh, that's terrifying. Maybe 27. I left school at 15 and I really wanted to work in IT. So I just sent a letter, because no email back then, to every IT company in the town, and I got an apprenticeship, and I started in IT really, really quickly. I progressed really quickly. I loved breaking things apart, understanding how they worked. I was building Novell NetWare servers back in the 90s, which was cool. And, I progressed really, really quickly, and then I wanted to travel. So I ended up taking a stop in Ireland. I thought, well, Ireland's a good place to stop. My parents lived there at the time. So I got on the ferry to Ireland to visit my parents for a few weeks, and then I was going to go to Europe. But when I got to Ireland, someone stole my suitcase, and I had, back in those days, it was all cash. People didn't use bank accounts as much. So I had all my cash, and everything I had was in my suitcase. And I was like, oh, I've got nothing. So I ended up getting a job in Ireland in a pub for a few months, living in a caravan with 7 Hungarians, and which was a bit of a experience, a fun experience actually, and then ended up getting into a corporate IT job in Cavan.
So, and of course, sort of the ThreatLocker experience, I suppose, did the genesis of the company start in Ireland as well?
No, so what happened was I started corporate IT in Ireland. I'd moved on. I started an email security company in Ireland. It was called MX Sweep. It was relatively successful. I made some fundamental errors when it came to who we accepted investment from, and that ended up with a 18-month high court battle, of which the lawyers won. I came out on top of the other two parties, and it was a pretty miserable experience, because I learned the hard way that when you take money from investors, you make sure you do it right. And the company carried on. It later on sold. I exited it. I started another email security company, and at that point, I was a little bit frustrated because I'd gone through this 18-month court battle. We weren't earning that much money, so we were earning 50,000, 60,000 euros a year, and we were paying ridiculous amounts of taxes. 2 kids were struggling to live. And so we said, hey, we want to move somewhere. Our customers at that point were in Hong Kong. They were in different countries. So we said, we want to move somewhere that's a little bit, got better weather, and maybe we're not going to have to give away half our income. And so we moved over to Malta for about a year, just short of a year. Once we were in Malta, we were like, there really isn't much to do in Malta. It's beautiful, but there's not much to do. So I was on a business trip in Florida, and I said, why don't we just move here? And 6 weeks later, we were in Florida with a 3-month-old baby.
It's good. That's quite the journey. It has to be said. A lot of unexpected and very pleasant surprises along the way. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, where ThreatLocker came from was really, once I was in Florida, I'd sold the second email security business to one of our customers, and I was doing ethical hacking and ended up doing ransomware recoveries over and over and over again. And we decided to create ThreatLocker really because we realized we cannot keep doing the same thing over and over again. this ransomware thing is destroying businesses, destroying hospitals, destroying everything. So we wanted to find a solution that actually solved that problem. And we tried to buy one, tried to go off and find products, and they didn't exist. And that's why we created ThreatLocker.
And in looking at ransomware recovery efforts, I suppose we're seeing it being a multifaceted problem where on the one side you have staff that might be aware of, how poor their online hygiene might be in terms of managing their passwords, in terms of who they allow access to their systems, whether they actually, click on that link they really shouldn't. And on the other side, you've got the IT teams tasked with coming in and resolving these problems very often in record time. Now, based on some reports I've seen, the mitigation effort time is actually improving quite a bit. Does this come down to that balanced approach of staff being more aware of the threats and sort of the IT teams being more au fait with the nature of these attacks and what can be done about them?
So I think we're seeing different types of attacks as well. So recovery times are a little bit faster now because we're seeing less encryption and more data theft, which is and they're essentially holding you hostage. If you don't pay this money, we're going to put your data on the internet. So we're seeing a little bit more of attackers getting their money from extortion as opposed to ransoms where they've encrypted your files. I think we have seen an increase in user training. Users have got a little bit better, but attackers are getting a little bit smarter in how they present to users. We're fighting AI at the same time, which is making it harder to. 5 years ago, half the scam emails were badly written English, so it was easier for a user to see. Now they're getting smarter. We're starting to see IT take responsibility or security, and every business divides security and IT differently. But we're starting to see more and more controls implemented in businesses. So instead of relying on the user being right, we're accepting that the user is going to make mistakes, and those mistakes shouldn't cost us a ransomware attack or a cyber attack. And that's really the direction of security, and that's the way it has to go. Because if you don't, I always say, who do you blame? And not to compare users to a 2-year-old. The 2-year-old or the parent, when the 2-year-old puts their hand on a hot stove, well, it's the parent's fault because they didn't put a guardrail around the stove. And that's the kind of same thing in cybersecurity. We can't expect a accountant that didn't even grow up with computers to understand the difference between a macro script and a Word document and am I downloading an executable or a PDF? You just can't expect a user to understand that. So you have to put those controls in place. And that's where we're seeing IT improve and needs to improve.
And of course, it's a continually evolving journey, largely now because of the evolution of threats thanks to AI, where, as you mentioned before, you might have had a poorly worded ransomware email. Now you can just put into ChatGPT, write me an extortion letter, please, and you'll get an output. How are you finding the evolution and the integration of AI into cybersecurity? Is this something that is happening increasingly at pace, or is it something that companies are still very wary of while they get to grips of using AI in their companies sort of officially at all?
So, and I think we have to break AI into two sections. So what we've seen over the last 2 years and 3 years is the reclassification of smart computing, if you like, or computers that are making decisions based on external sources as artificial intelligence. So if we were to go back 7 years ago, and you were to have a program that looks at lots of people opening files on the internet, determines that this file has suddenly rapidly evolved, it's changed data, and it automatically blocks it. 7 years ago, that was just called their intelligence agent, their brain, or whatever. Today, it's now been reclassified as AI. So a lot of what we hear security vendors talking about is now being reworded to be AI. And the reason being is because of the use of LLMs. And LLMs is obviously what sparked AI, which is the ability to create something using artificial intelligence, which is completely different to making a decision based on data that has learned across millions of endpoints. So I think in one side, we're obviously seeing an explosion of the use of AI, but 95% of that explosion is really not because of new AI. It's just technology being redefined, because now we've created the definition. Just like when ThreatLocker started, the word zero trust was very rarely used. Now the idea of least privilege has been redefined, and that's what we see with AI. But we're also seeing AI used in two areas in cybersecurity. The first one that concerns me the most is obviously the phishing emails, but also the creation of malware. Today, you can create malware that's never been seen before, that's completely unique in seconds, and you don't even have to be an engineer to do that. So ChatGPT will write you a piece of software that will find where somebody stores their files and uploads them to Google Cloud. You just have to call it backup software and it does it for you. So we're seeing AI used extensively in malware, but also sometimes in determining data. The accuracy is, what do we think this is? Now, the big concern with it is AI cannot determine intent. So when you think about a piece of bad software that you download on your computer, a piece of malware, backup software and data exfiltration software are exactly the same in functionality. So if you look at AI to determine is something good or bad, it can't, because it can't determine the intent of why something was written. The other problem is it's not actually that accurate where it does determine what something is. And I'll give you the best example I can give you is classification of websites. So in ThreatLocker, we have a web filtering solution, and you can go in as a business and say, I want to block adult sites, I want to block gambling sites, I want to block phishing sites and things like this. Of the sites, and I've got to word this correctly, because of the sites that AI will classify as adult, explicit, 70% of them are accurate. They were adult. If you take a same human data, it's somewhere between 99.4 and 99 point something percent. I can't remember the exact number. A human will get it right. So if you have a human look at 100 websites or 1,000 websites, 6 of them they're going to say are adult and they weren't adult, just because they're tired, they've made a mistake, they've clicked the wrong button. Whereas if you ask AI, 300 of them are not going to be adult sites or explicit sites that they put into category. So where the smart people are using AI is not to replace necessarily humans, but to augment. Because now when you combine that 99.4% with the 70%, you end up with and like 99.9%. It gets substantially higher. And you can reduce the likelihood of a false positive by comparing and analyzing user data and comparing it to intellectual data. And you can also get quick decisions that are best effort, where we don't have to wait for a human to make the decision. So in the event that you can't wait, we can say, just give me an answer now, and we'll take that as our best answer.
So, of course, and we're also looking at, this new landscape of threats, but I guess it brings with it a certain amount of urban mythology with it as well, as to what AI sort of can do for you that maybe it can't. I mean, the idea of having the human in the loop is common sense, and I think most people have absorbed that now. Have you come across any expectations people have where you hear it and you're thinking that's not what AI does at the moment?
I think the expectation, because ChatGPT and LLMs have done such a great job at sounding like a human, people believe that they're able to process data like a human. And it can't, because what LLMs are actually doing is they're literally testing the next character, the next possibility to say, is this a logical fit? And the one thing that about AI is it's very, very confidently wrong. So if I kind of liken it to my father. If he doesn't know something, he's an older guy. He just makes it up and says, this is it. And he will talk about it like it's a matter of fact, like he's researched this for 5 years. And that's a little bit like AI. It will give you answers, and people think it's intelligently coming up with conclusions. It's not. It's just ingesting a load of data and spitting out what it finds. And that data can be bad data as well. So it's not what people often think, that it's some super intelligent being, but it is very, very good at creating content, and it is very good at doing basic math or advanced math and analyzing images and doing things like that. When you think about AI for threat detection and what's being reclassified as AI, that has actually got nothing to do with ChatGPT or LLMs. That's more to do with, hey, we're looking at data across millions of endpoints and we're making a decision. This is normal behavior for this application because we've seen it 200,000 times before, and this is now out of behavior.
So let's have a look at what companies can do to make themselves more resilient. I mean, as I mentioned, it is that sort of, actually, as we discussed, it is that trade-off between what staff on the ground can do versus what the IT department can mitigate. And you can't expect staff to be experts in IT threats. The important thing is just to make sure that they have to make as few decisions as possible when it comes to identifying it. What challenges are you finding at the moment, and how are you dealing with them?
Okay, so the reality is, one thing that I often see that frustrates me is headlines like a sophisticated cyber attack took down a hospital, or a sophisticated cyber attack took down a pipeline or a casino. More often than not, these are not sophisticated cyber attacks. That's the truth of it. They're very basic attacks. It required a user to open something they shouldn't have done. They clicked on it. It gave an attacker access to the machine. There was no controls in place to stop untrusted software. There was no controls in place to stop a user from downloading any program they wanted. So the smart approach for this is really this idea that if we can, we're seeing lots of new types of malware, undetectable malware that hasn't seen before, but the principles of cybersecurity should be the same principles as any security. If you don't need access to something, we're going to remove and revoke that access. So most users run 20 different apps on their computer, 10 different apps, Office, Chrome, Zoom, Teams, QuickBooks or Sage or whatever it may be. And they run those apps and that's what they do in their day-to-day. So when they download malware or they download something that interacts with an app they don't need, it's going to be allowed unless it's known to be bad. So the reality is we should train our users. We should make users aware. And for two reasons. The smarter we make our users, the more IT people we get in the world, because there's a natural progression there too. But we should also be relying on technology specialists to put controls in place in a business. So you can't just run untrusted software. The software you do run doesn't have access to all of your files. And that's the sad reality of it. If you download a game on your computer now, it can see all of your files. And people often don't realize that I just downloaded this free game from made in China and it can see my files.
Of course, trust there is the most important word that in that answer there, because what you work with is zero trust system. So tell us a little bit about what you're doing in ThreatLocker in that respect.
Yeah, so the idea of zero trust is really this idea of not blocking everything. Everyone thinks it means no one can do anything. It's not. It means least privilege. It means what do you need to do in your environment. So if your job as a developer, you might need to compile new code, run that code, access databases from that code, and that's part of your job. If you are a receptionist, you might need to run Office and a browser, browse the internet, go to certain websites. So the idea of zero trust is you only allow what is needed. What ThreatLocker does is really give you the ability to deploy that really, really easily. So instead of you going in saying, I've got 3,000 employees, I have no idea what they do on their day-to-day basis. I'm an IT guy that really doesn't understand every facet of the business. So I'm going to deploy a tool to help me understand that. And that's what ThreatLocker does, is we basically go into your environment, we show you everything that's running currently and what it's doing. We highlight risks in your configuration. So we'll test 170 checks every day for bad configuration risks and tell you why they're risks. We'll also show you the risks of changing those configurations, because people often don't think, well, we should have a lock policy on our computer. Let's just put lock policies on our computers. But if you're in an airport and you've got public displays and you suddenly set them to lock after 15 minutes, then that's going to be bad. So we'll tell you some of those risks about, hey, zero trust means you should lock machines when people aren't at them, but don't forget to exclude your airport displays and hospital displays and anything else that might be relevant. So we'll help you go through that. We'll show you what software you have, what country it was developed in, what it has access to, and then we'll give you suggested controls to put around it. So we'll say, let's block untrusted software. It's very easy to do. We can easily approve new software. Let's limit what the software can do. Let's control what categories of websites people can and can't go to. People shouldn't be going to explicit sites on their work computer. And we just do this in a very easy to use interface. And what this does is this takes away 99% of the risk of cyber, and also gives you takes away also 80% of your IT work, because people aren't breaking their machines anymore by mistake.
Looking to the future then, have you seen any particular attacks or developments that have made you sit up and go, oh, that's particularly devious? It's impressive in its own way.
So I think the two things I suppose that shocked me that I didn't think out, and bear in mind, I spent a few years as an ethical hacker, I understand security really well. But the two things that I suppose keep me up at night or shock me, one was the first time I saw a rubber ducky or an OMG cable. A rubber ducky is a little hacking device, and if I have one here, you basically plug it into a computer. Even if you block USB drives, it's going to send keystrokes, and it can do things like put a reverse shell on the machine. We did a demo last night at a small business event here in Orlando, Florida, where we actually just plugged it in, exfilled all the data, no alert from the EDR or the antivirus, and it just used tools built into Windows. And it shocked me because in my mind, if I plugged the USB drive in, I had to open a file on it, and I didn't even think. Of course, once they said to me, well, it's not actually a USB drive, it's a keyboard that's pre-programmed, or an OMG cable that looks exactly like an iPhone cable that will transmit a wireless antenna. That shocked me. The one that keeps me up at night, the only one that really scares me, is the SolarWinds Orion. Because in that case, as a customer, you buy a piece of software and you put trust in it. And of course, that's why we believe zero trust. But SolarWinds Orion was compromised in end of 2019. And essentially an attacker got into their source code and put a backdoor in the source code. The source code didn't do anything bad for 3 weeks. And after 3 weeks, it reached out to the internet and got instructions, run PowerShell, do some bad things on my machine. The problem is, and this is why I think it's sophisticated, gaining access to someone's source code, not sophisticated. Gaining access to the source code, getting code through their code review process, which obviously wasn't very tight, getting them to deploy it, getting it through QA, and then getting the federal government in the United States to deploy it as a Russian nation state. That is kind of raises hairs on the back of your neck thing. This is terrifying that they went through all that hassle to go to a target vendor to get code in to then that they knew was used in the federal government. And then suddenly the Russian government has access to federal computers in the US. So not just the US, but also companies, organizations, governments all over the world. So I think that was pretty impressive, but also terrifying.
Mm. Lastly, something that's been in the news the last few weeks, we've reached the end of life of Windows 10. We're all meant to be moving on to Windows 11. How have you been finding that migration going? When it comes to operating systems, personally anyway, when I find one that I particularly like, then it's quite the effort to actually upgrade to the next one. For example, Windows XP took people an awful long time to actually, forgo it. And even then, there was an extended support cycle. Similarly with Windows 7, and now we're getting into Windows 10, where enterprise customers can have up to 3 years of extended support. How are you finding that migration? Is it a case of, well, it's come up on my computer, so it's been really easy to do, let's just do it? Or has there still been that sort of, that caution of, well, how long can we string out our Windows 10 support?
Okay, so there's a couple of differences between Windows 10 and 11. The Windows 11 upgrade is, of course, free of charge, so it's not an expense for businesses in most cases. Windows 11 is really just a slight upgrade to Windows 10. When we look at Windows XP to Windows Vista, it was an awful transition. It was a major rewrite. And Microsoft were almost, the way they were doing updates back then, they were just testing the world. And they'd release an operating system that was stable, and then they'd release an operating system that was bold. And then they'd release an operating system that's stable, and then they'd release an operating system that was bold. So you went from XP to Vista, which was a disaster, to Windows 7, which was fantastic, to Windows 8, which was a disaster, to Windows 10. Microsoft since then have been doing these half-year updates, and the Windows 11 is really just a half-year update. It's still labeled as Windows 10. It's still Windows 10 under the hood. It literally shows the same version number. If you do an update, it uses the same functions, which is nice because it means the upgrade to companies is really a micro upgrade. Where it's become problematic is the two areas. One is it needs a TPM chip. So in some cases, the hardware will not support it. And so this has caused some companies who've got older hardware to have to upgrade their hardware. The other thing is IT managers who have automatic updates turned off because they can't afford to have their entire organization upgrade, have now, and just deployed security patches, are now stuck with the need to update it centrally, to the point where we had customers begging us for a solution, and we don't typically deal with operating system upgrades, but we just integrate it into a feature into our system where you can press a button and it'll update the machine remotely without any impact from the user. So I think they're the two issues. Is one is suddenly this came across very, very fast. I know everyone's known about it, but it wasn't talked about. Like Windows 7 was talked about forever. So everyone knew about it for a long time. But Windows 11 or Windows 10, to Windows 11, it became up really, really fast on people. And they're like, oh, I've got to upgrade 3,000 machines. So we put some features in just to help that for our customers. But it's not a major upgrade. The only concern is if you've got really old hardware.
And that was Danny Jenkins from ThreatLocker.
This is Tech Radio with Dusty Rhodes and Niall Kitson.
That's it for our show this week. In the meantime, you might like to check out some more stories on techcentral.ie, including Tesla introducing a subscription model for self-driving cars, Google's founders considering leaving California for even sunnier climes, that's possible, and the Grok image generation controversy. You'll find all these and more online at techcentral.ie. I'll be back again next Friday, and remember, please share the podcast with a friend. Just tell them to look up Tech Radio Ireland on Apple, Spotify, or your platform of choice. I'm Niall Kitson. Catch you next week.
Remember, you can get the latest Irish tech news with hourly updates, daily newsletters, and more at our website, techcentral.ie. Share the knowledge and invite a friend to listen. Search Apple, Spotify, or YouTube for Tech Radio Ireland, or listen with RTE Radio 1 Extra. Tech Radio is produced by dustpod.io for techcentral.ie. From me, Artemis, live long and prosper.